The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
You know, as a busy mom, there are lots of ways you can help yourself fall asleep. You could stare blankly at the ceiling and replay every conversation you've ever had, count sheep, have a debate with your pillow, give up caffeine, try acupuncture, and buy a weighted blanket that will make you sweat profusely. Or you could try some milk, which has nutrients that support healthy sleep. Visit GonnaNeedMilk.com for more info, and for everyone's sake, please don't give up caffeine.
So good, so good, so good. Just in and so good. Thousands of winter deals are in Nordstrom Rack stores now. And that means thousands of fresh reasons to rack.
Because we get the latest trends for way less.
Because I've been looking for these.
Because the best deals go fast.
Save big with up to 60% off. Sam Edelman, Sorel, Free People, Cole Haan, and more cold weather finds. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. Hey, and welcome to this week's episode. At this point, I guess you know it's about a cult. You know that much. So I'll give you the rest of the preamble in a moment. But right now, I just want to jump straight into a vignette. Today's story takes us back to the 5th of October, 1994. We're in Switzerland, and it's a cool night in autumn. It's 1 a.m., and there's a bit of drizzle, and the phone rings at the judge's registry in Freiburg. The man on duty that night is actually a local judge, but you don't need to know his name, so I won't give it. What's important is that the voice on the line tells this man that there's been a house fire in a small town about 40 minutes away. What's going on, asks the judge. Why do you need me? The voice on the line tells him it's kind of hard to explain. Please, just come here, as soon as you can. An hour later, this judge arrived in the village of Sherry. It's a small, bucolic village with a population of about 270, and like everywhere in Switzerland, it's just a whole lot of hilly pastures with the Alps in the background. It's a really pretty place, but right now it's dark, so the landscape's all buried. And the only thing that's visible, as the judge crests a hill, is a big blaze on the edge of the village. It's a barn, and the judge drives into the village and pulls up at a farm signposted as La Rochette. He gets out, and at the farmhouse, he's greeted by several investigators from Freiburg who he knows well, and they usher him inside. The house stinks of petrol as they lead him through a kitchen and then into a living room and then upstairs. The judge notices that there's all these swollen garbage bags lining the walls, and someone tells him that they're homemade incendiary devices that, for some reason, hadn't gone off. They're basically just big garbage bags full of petrol sitting on heater filaments and wired to some complicated electronics that were connected to the house telephone. The police had removed the detonators but hadn't yet removed the bags because they wanted to show this judge upstairs. They arrived on a small landing and there was suddenly a different kind of smell on the air. And then they filed into a bedroom where they found a body slumped in a single bed. The judge recognized the face immediately, even though it was smeared in blood. It's a man named Albert Jacobino, the retired owner of the farm. One of the police officers explained that they found him with a plastic bag over his head. They'd taken the bag off, but the judge can see that Albert died of a single gunshot to the head. Later, this judge, he told journalists that his first impression was that they'd stumbled into a case of arson-suicide, but he was only half right. Once the firefighters got the blaze in the barn under control, they quickly found a doorway in the floor which led down into the basement. Or they thought it was the basement. As they cautiously moved down some concrete steps, they found a small room with walls painted red and suitcases and boxes of documents stacked on desks. It looked like a meeting had just taken place, except everyone had just walked out. And then the men saw yet more garbage bags full of petrol, messily rigged together with wires. Whoever had done this apparently wanted the documents burned, but the devices hadn't gone off. It seemed like the only working incendiary device on the entire property had been in the upstairs barn. At first, this room with the red walls, it kind of seemed like a dead end, so they started rifling through the paperwork. Later, weeks later, they'd find documents detailing a dispute between the farm's owner and the leadership of a group called the Order of the Solar Temple, or in French, l'Ordre du Temple Solitaire, the OTS for short. Most of the investigators in this room, they knew of the Solar Temple. Freiburg is not exactly a big place, and the locals had often joked about it being a cult, so this base level of suspicion motivated them to keep searching for answers. At about 4 a.m., they found another secret door. It was a section of red wall paneling that pushed in, and behind it they found a narrow corridor filled with more petrol-filled garbage bags. And at the end of this corridor, these small-town police officers, who'd spent most of their careers responding to traffic infringements and petty crime, they entered this room. And the room, it was terrifying. It was small, but it was somehow crudely built to look impressive. The walls were all plywood, but they'd been painted red with an enormous chandelier strung from the ceiling. But the part that got everyone's attention was the floor. 18 bodies, all dressed in red and white silk robes, were spilled out all over the ground, arranged in a circle. Like the spokes on a wheel, with every body radiating from the center, feet pointing out. All had been shot in the head, and about half of them had black plastic bags tied around their heads. Some of them also had their hands tied behind their backs. And just quickly looking around, it seemed as though at least one of the bodies was a boy. He looked like he was probably about 12. Empty champagne bottles and bullet casings littered the floor, and watching over the whole scene was a painting of a Christ-like figure with a rose hanging above his head, hanging from the wall. It was a lot to take in, but there was another doorway, and they passed through to find yet another room. This one was smaller, but it was shaped like an octagon and lined with mirrors. And on the floor there were another 3 bodies. Then finally, one more room and another body laying alone. Altogether, the police and this judge from Freiburg counted 23 bodies in this labyrinthine cluster of rooms under the farm. A total of 20 people had been shot with a gun, sometimes 3 times over, and all in the head. 3 people seemed to be free of visible injuries, while about half of them had plastic bags tied over their heads. And just looking around, everyone knew this was huge. Everyone in this underground temple knew that they were looking at some kind of massacre. A few of them knew that the farm was owned by a cult, but they didn't know much more. And they also had no idea that this was just the start. The next day, they were going to find another mass suicide site nearby, with another 25 bodies in silk robes scattered through a series of ski chalets. And they didn't know that there was going to be another mass suicide the next year, in 1995, and then another one the year after, and then another one in 1997. And all of that is to say, I think this is the single wildest cult story that's never been told. Not many people know about this story. If you say to the average person, hey, name a couple of cult stories, they'll be like, geez, Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, there's one on Netflix about an Indian guy. Maybe they'll say that kind of thing, but that's usually it. But this story, in my humble opinion, is the biggest and weirdest one. We're talking about a group called the Order of the Solar Temple, which flourished for about 15 years through France, Switzerland, and Quebec, before snuffing themselves out via 5 mass suicides staged over 4 years. And there's a few reasons why I find this cult interesting. First of all, they were a big, rich organization with millions of dollars in cash and real estate spread around the world. This wasn't some two-bit operation. They recruited from Europe's elite, and their ranks included the mayor of a French town, a Quebec finance official, a French nuclear engineer, and the heir to a French skiwear brand called Vonnet. Run your finger down a member list of this group, and it's kind of like reading the trophies at a ski lodge. And yet, these same people orchestrated some of the darkest events in modern European history. And I just find it surprising that a group of well-educated, successful, and, seemingly happy people can choose to end their lives for mere beliefs. Or more specifically, I guess, because they believed that death was going to deliver them to some kind of paradise. That's such a bizarre thing to believe, right? And yet our ability to believe in bizarre things it kind of seems to be the cornerstone of human psychology. We love a shared story. I think our ability to share dreams is actually what's so beautiful about humanity. But then on the flip side, it's also what allows us to commit mass suicides. Many people throughout history have chosen to die not because they're depressed or in pain, but because they believe that a kind of portal is going to open up and transport them to a perfect world. And I just find that fascinating. I mean, just give me a moment here. What are the actual on-ground mechanics of this? Do people in cults who are about to shoot themselves or ingest poison, do they feel nervous before they die? Do they make speeches? Do they hug each other and do they cry? Do some people just get cold feet and decide to go home? And I know this is a pretty grim thought experiment, but it's interesting, right? Many cults have ended in mass suicide. 909 people died in Jonestown in 1978. 7 members of a Japanese group called Friend of the Truth Church died in 1986. Heaven's Gate also ended with a mass suicide of 39 members in 1997. And in each of these examples, the cult ended with a single case of mass suicide. But what's unique about the Order of the Solar Temple is that it ended with 5, spread between 1994 and 1997 across Switzerland, France, and Canada. And these were different people from different countries. They died at different times, and presumably they were in different headspaces. And yet, they all went ahead with it. And that, to me, is what makes the Order of the Solar Temple such a unique story. It's like this fascinating little petri dish of human psychology to kind of just examine the nature of belief. Like, what makes people die for their beliefs? And what kinds of people invent stories that ultimately demand death from their followers? So these are big questions, right? This is kind of ambitious, but I'm going to try to answer some of this stuff by looking at this story. And I just want to clarify that I'm not going to speak to anyone. It's just going to be you and me. I've always wanted to do this story. And you know what? Despite my best efforts, I've never been able to find a survivor of the Solar Temple who speaks English. That's realistically why this story has managed to fly under the radar for so long. I think this is a really famous case in France and Switzerland and Quebec, but it's never quite permeated into the English language world. So I'm going to do my best to bring it to you based on all of the academic texts and archived newspaper articles that I can find in English. And we're going to do this in 2 parts, okay? So in this episode, I'm going to set up the backstory and kind of the crisis point at which the cult became homicidal. And then in part 2, we're going to run through the mass suicides and do some analysis. All right, let's do it. Here is the story of the Order of the Solar Temple. The story begins with a guy named Joseph de Mambre. He was born on the 19th of August, 1924, in this little French town called Pointe-Saint-Esprit. And yes, I'm going to be butchering French pronunciation throughout this whole episode. This little town, it's a cute place. It's in the south. It's not far from Montpellier. And this guy, he was the oldest of 3 siblings. His dad was an immigrant from northern Italy. He was a glassworker, and his mum was a seamstress. Now, apparently, de Mambre was really close to his mum, but he didn't like his dad very much. Apparently, he viewed his dad as lacking ambition. And de Mambre, from the youngest age, he was obsessed with status and appearances. At school, he got bullied for his Italian heritage, and he channeled his frustration into reading books on the occult. Then at the age of 16, he got an apprenticeship as a jeweler and a watchmaker. And this is basically a snapshot of who he remained his whole life. Ambitious and obsessed with pomp and mysticism. The next big data point here is that de Mambre got married in 1944. He was pretty young, he was just 20 years old, and they had a single child named Bernard. Not much is known about his first wife, except that she was a music teacher. But I can tell you a bit about Bernard because he actually grew up to be an actor, and you can find him on Google. He's got an IMDb page. He appeared in some French films with such titles as Terror of Prehistoric Bloody Monster from Space and Time Demon 2. And it actually seems that Bernard lived a pretty long life, while many of de Membro's kids died in the 1994 mass suicides. More on that later. In his 20s, de Membro became increasingly interested in spiritualism. He was reading a lot of books about New Age religion, and he got occasional work as a medium. In fact, around town he became known for his mystical abilities. But then, in 1966, almost at the age of 40, he divorced his first wife. I would imagine that something a little untoward was going on, because that same year he got married again, this time to a woman named Helena Garcia. Then a year later, he got into trouble allegedly ripping off a business partner. So he'd met another jeweler, and the idea was that they were going to start this jewelry business together. But apparently, de Membro disappeared with all of this guy's jewels and his money, and the two of them never spoke again. And to me, this isn't that surprising, for two reasons. The first is that de Membro, he kind of just looks like a slimy guy. And I know this is unscientific, but I'm also right. Google Joseph de Membro and you'll see this man with a mustache and this mop of bristly grey hair. But I don't know, there's something about him. He's kind of chubby and he's got these flat, hooded eyes. He's no looker, but that's not really the problem. He just looks a bit slimy. And I think the other problem is that I've done a lot of podcasts on cults now. I've gone through this process of doing all this research and, writing up a script and really thinking about a cult for a long time. So I'm just seeing these through lines between this guy, Joseph de Membro, and a whole bunch of other cult leaders that I've effectively studied. They're always just kind of the same guy. I've got this equation, and the equation is this. Like, if you want to run a cult, then you need to have petty criminal instincts combined with just delusions of grandeur. Through the 1970s, he was actually hauled into court a few times. First for fraudulently posing as a psychologist, and then for writing a series of bad checks. And a quick note here. Someone's actually put all these old conviction documents on Reddit, if you'd like to take a look. We'll put them in the show notes too, just if you want to go deep. Anyway, at around the same time, very early 70s, de Membro actually decided to abandon his career as a jeweler and a clockmaker, and he decided to become a full-time lecturer. And he started traveling around France to share his teachings about the coming New Age. And he established a thing called the Center for the Preparation of the New Age in 1973, and that went semi-well. And then 3 years later, he founded another group called La Pyramide, basically the pyramid, which started meeting in a house in the Geneva countryside for discussions about diet and spirituality. And then this was replaced by another group called the Golden Way Foundation in 1978. So we're rushing through some pretty big stepping stones here, but the headline is that de Membro was practicing to preach. Okay, he was getting better, and he was setting up all these organizations, peddling New Age mythology, and he started claiming, of course, to be an incarnation of several significant historical figures, including Jesus, surprise, and an Egyptian pharaoh. And, this is just such a classic move. It's taken straight out of the cult playbook. Now, the thing that really supercharged de Membro's influence was that he made a new friend in 1981. He met a Belgian homeopath named Luc Jouret. And while de Membro wasn't much of a looker, or really a convincing mystic, Jouret was both. First of all, he looked great. You can watch videos of this guy delivering talks on YouTube, and he's got this enormous mop of perfect hair and these dark, piercing eyes. He's actually got the same eyes as John Mayer. I don't know. Have a look. Tell me I'm wrong. But he also had this soothing voice, and by all accounts, this guy, Jouret, he was an amazing public speaker. In fact, I've got an account here from a former member who went to a Jouret lecture in 1990, and here's what he said about seeing the man for the very first time. You start listening, and by God, you just all of a sudden feel so attracted to what he's saying. You talk about the universe. You talk about how man is made of 4 ingredients and how the stars are made of these same 4 ingredients. Then you go back to Egypt and Egyptology, and then somewhere along the line comes the possibility of extraterrestrials. And it goes on and it goes on like that. But the more you hear, the less you understand, and therefore, the more you want to know. You slowly get caught up in the web. So this partnership proved to be really beneficial for both of them. Jouret's charisma and his eloquence drew in the big crowds. But Dimambro, he already had a business and he had established locations to give talks. So the two of them started working together and officially set up the Order of the Solar Temple in 1987. And what the Order of the Solar Temple did at first was basically just deliver talks. They organized talks all around Europe. And these were for anyone who grew up during the age of Aquarius. You know, these hippies who had really believed in peace, love, organic food, and they found themselves in the 1980s feeling a little untethered. And they'd go to these New Age forums and they'd see this handsome Frenchman named Jouret talk, and they'd be like, wow, this is good. And out of the hundreds of people that came to these public lectures, at least a handful would be really into it. And then Dimambro and his associates would hone in on them and groom them. And that's how they started growing the cult. They started bringing in new members to the fold. And by the end of the 1980s, they actually had hundreds of followers, and they decided to expand into North America. So they bought a farm on the shore of the St. Lawrence River between Montreal and Quebec City. And they set up headquarters in an old orphanage where Jouret was positioned as the organization's North American manager. And there, they started running programs on various disciplines in the science of life. And they also hosted chamber music concerts and, inverted commas, spectacles. And people started coming from all over Quebec for these spectacles. I'm going to walk you through these in a moment because I think it was really the draw card for the cult in the early years. But first, we should just spend a moment talking about the cult's belief systems. Because while they're completely bananas, they're kind of important. So here we go. Okay. According to Dimambro and Jouret, a blue star appeared in the sky 26,000 years ago. This star, called Sirius, was the home to a number of divine celestial beings who came to Earth and have existed in human form among us for thousands of years. One of these beings was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the founder of the medieval Knights Templar. And if you don't know what the Knights Templar is, that's okay. I'm going to explain. Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
As the days get shorter and the nights chillier, it's tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings workouts and wellness to the comfort of your home. Join allomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to sound baths and meditations, Alo Moves has it all, with classes made to fit every schedule. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with code ACAST at allomoves.com.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Bombas presents unsolicited gifting advice. Number 1, if they say not to get them anything, get them something. 2, underwear is a great gift, just not for your boss. And 3, those absurdly soft Bombas socks and slippers you've been eyeing for yourself? They'll love those. And the fact that for every item you purchase, another is donated to someone who needs it, they'll love that even more.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
The Knights Templar were really important to the mythology of the Solar Temple. And while most of their mythology was purely fiction, the Knights Templar, they actually existed. They were a French military order founded in 1119 AD to defend Christian pilgrims who were on their way from Europe to Jerusalem. And they wore these distinctive white outfits with a red cross, just like the Templars. And they started out as basically religious chaperones. But then they started slowly turning into bankers. And by 1307, they turned into this very powerful corporate/spiritual conglomerate. And then King Philip of France ordered them to be rounded up and burned at the stake. That's where the Knights Templar ended, except that there's always been suspicion that they'd somehow managed to survive through to the modern day. And de Membro and Jurette, they convinced their followers that that's exactly what they were. They were direct descendants, not just of the Knights Templar, but of the original ascended beings that had arrived on Earth from the star Sirius 26,000 years ago. And they were on Earth to take true believers back home with them, back to paradise, back to the star of Sirius. Okay, did you get all that? I know it's a lot. I honestly doubt all of the members did either, but then, hey, maybe it didn't matter. I actually think for most people, the real thrill was just kind of being part of this secret club with all of these cool Da Vinci Code style meetings. So the Solar Temple, if you haven't picked up on it yet, they're obsessed with secret things. Secret temples, secret rooms, secret rituals. And their best spectacles were secret rituals performed in secret underground chambers. And they built these underground complexes full of hidden rooms and meeting spaces under a whole bunch of their properties. And it was in these subterranean rooms that they held their secret rituals, which honestly were probably quite impressive. Ceremonies were always held in medieval robes with lots of candles, lots of chanting, and they used lasers and projectors and sound effects to create light and basically like light and sound shows. And people swore that they saw lightning storms and moving three-dimensional holograms of these original beings from Sirius. But really, what they were actually seeing was just like literal smoke and mirrors. The group had actually recruited a Swiss tradesman named Tony Druot, who had a knack for putting together stage shows. He wired hidden lights and speakers into temple walls so that when a ritual was happening, the various cult members in robes would start chanting, and they'd be joined in by all of these other voices, supposedly from other dimensions. But what was really going on was just like Tony's hidden speakers were playing all this backup chanting. Something that's really interesting is that you can actually watch one of these rituals play out in a video that was confiscated by the Quebec police. I'm going to describe it. It goes like this. It starts with two Templars, and they're wearing these white robes, and they're leading a man, and he's wearing just like a basic kind of business suit, and they're leading him down this corridor, and it's all very misty, like there's a bit of Vaseline smeared over the lens. And then this businessman, he kneels before a priest who takes out a sword and lightly taps it on this businessman's right shoulder, and then on his left shoulder, and then on the top of his head. Then the camera cuts to a red rose, and then we see a close-up of Luc Jurette standing in front of a crackling open fire. And that's it. That's how the video ends. It's all pretty nonsensical and dorky, but apparently rich Europeans got into it. In a big way. By 1989, the order had an official tally of 442 members worldwide. That was 90 members in Switzerland, 187 members in France, 53 in Martinique, 16 in the USA, 86 in Canada, and 10 people in Spain. And by this stage, Jurette and de Membro had become accustomed to lavish lifestyles. They owned lots of property all over Europe, North America, and Australia. Lots of cars, lots of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, stays in five-star hotels. DiMambro and his inner circle once even chartered a private jet to Manhattan for the weekend, just to attend an opera at the Met. These were the good times. But as you can probably guess, the facade started to fall away with the dawn of the 1990s. What I've observed doing stories on cults is that they always seem to disintegrate in the same way. And it always starts when their public image starts to fail. This was the pattern for Jonestown, and it was the pattern for the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo, and it was definitely how things soured for the Solar Temple. For them, the downward spiral set in motion when a Swiss couple named Rosemarie and Bruno Klaus joined the cult. Bruno had allegedly been cured of cancer by Luc Jouret, and he became a devoted member. They packed up their lives in Switzerland, and they moved to Quebec to be closer to Jouret, and they invested heavily in the farm, allegedly donating 300,000 Canadian dollars. But the problem was that Rosemarie was never accepted into the group. In fact, Rosemarie and Bruno were instructed to break up. They were told that they were not actually each other's eternal partners, and they needed to be coupled with other people in the cult. And by the way, this wasn't uncommon. The cult often put together couples via something that they called cosmic weddings, and they didn't care at all about age discrepancies. So here's a few examples. Under the cult's direction, one woman was in her mid-30s when she was told to hook up with DiMambro's 14-year-old son. Also, DiMambro was 58 when he began an affair with a 21-year-old woman named Dominique Bellaton. And then later, this same woman, Bellaton, she was in her 30s when she started an affair with the skiwear fashion heir, who was 14 years younger. So this kind of thing was common, but Rosemarie, she didn't go for it. Instead, she continued to live with Bruno in a house just down the street from the cult's Quebec headquarters, in limbo and just furious about it. And then, sometime in 1990, she started telling her friends, including a police officer who she met at her daughter's primary school, just what had been going down. And this was the first time that somebody had started publicly criticizing the Order of the Solar Temple. And one of the friends, they suggested to Rosemarie that she get in touch with this anti-cult group called InfoSect, which was this privately funded organization in Montreal to help families of cult members and ex-members of cults. Anyway, InfoSect, they just took her story and ran with it. And Rosemarie ended up getting quoted publicly in a lot of newspapers, which was very damaging for the cult. And then, on top of that, she took them to court. And at the end of 1992, the courts sided with her, and they ordered a settlement from the Solar Temple for 150,000 Canadian dollars. And this was about half the money that she was owed. But this seems to have validated her experience, and she started getting even louder. She was just giving scathing quotes to any newspaper that had run them. As an example, here's a quote that she gave to a tabloid, a Canadian tabloid, about how they were starving their own members and encouraging them to eat semen. So the quote says this: "Jouret would reduce our food rations. We lived almost exclusively on peanut butter and bread, because Jouret said that we must fast in order to survive the end of time. When a woman complained that she was weak with hunger, we were told that sperm would restore her lost strength." So you can imagine that with press like that, all sorts of members started to leave. And DiMambro and Luc Jouret, they doubled down on this idea that the group had become a persecuted entity, just like the original Knights Templar. In fact, DiMambro responded by becoming increasingly authoritarian. He started actively coercing his European members into communal living arrangements, and their houses became isolated compounds. Luc Jouret, he was also feeling the pressure, because over in Quebec, he asked two of his minions to buy him a gun. So these minions, they started asking around. First, they asked a policeman whose wife had attended several of Jouret's lectures. He said that he could provide pistols, but not silencers. So then they went to a karate instructor who recommended a student in one of the classes who had done some time for drug dealing. And this was just pure coincidence, but it just so happened that this karate student was a police informant. Now, a little bit of global context here. At the same time this was happening, the siege in Waco had just started in the United States. And you might remember this, but another cult called the Branch Davidians had shot and killed 4 ATF agents in Texas, and then they'd barricaded themselves inside their compound with dozens of kids armed to the teeth. This siege started in February 1993, just around the same time as cult members with the Solar Temple started asking a police informant in Quebec for a gun. Unsurprisingly, a sting was put together. The police informant offered the temple members not 1, but 3 semi-automatic guns with silencers, which are actually illegal weapons in Canada. Jourette's phone ended up getting wiretapped, along with the 2 guys who were doing the buying. And on the 8th of March, 1983, Quebec police sent in a SWAT team and arrested the guys buying the guns. An arrest warrant was also issued for Jourette, but he was in Europe at the time. In the end, after the whole thing had gone through a court process, all 3 men got off with a fairly light slap on the wrist, but the whole thing was a public relations disaster for the group. One Canadian newspaper ran a headline calling "The Cult at the End of the World." Then Rosemarie Klaus called for a press conference on the 10th of March, and she told everyone about the group's freestyle approach to sex and finances. And all of this had a pretty negative effect on Demember and on Jourette. Audience members for Jourette's lectures now fell off a cliff, and he sunk into a deep, deep funk. One ex-member described him as being in a very depressed mood, constantly complaining about feeling tired and expressing eagerness to leave the world. Another member said that his mind changed. He was a tired, disappointed, disillusioned person. Meanwhile, over the Atlantic, Demember was having an equally bad time in Switzerland. He was now in his 70s, and he had been diagnosed with kidney problems that made him incontinent. He'd also contracted diabetes, and he began to experience diabetic fits. Then in 1993, he was diagnosed with cancer, which gave him an overriding sense of urgency and desperation. His empire was crumbling, the money was drying up, and his health was failing. And he became a desperate, angry man. And then came the final straw. Do you remember Tony Dutoit? This was Demember's longtime technical assistant who wired up all the sound systems in the cult's temples. So he and his wife Nikki, they decided to have a child, a boy, and they announced that they were going to name this boy Christopher Emmanuel. And now this really annoyed Demember because he had an 11-year-old daughter, also named Emanuela, and he'd long seen her as his cosmic daughter. So he ordered this couple, hey, don't name your kid Emmanuel. Do not use that name. That is my daughter's name. But they went ahead anyway. Because by this point, Tony and Nikki, they were on the outskirts of the cult. They'd distanced themselves when all the negative press attention started up. And Tony, he'd actually been leaking information about how the special effects worked for the rituals, so he'd clearly turned against Demember. And they decided to go ahead and have this child, who was born in July 1994. And just as they promised, they named him Christopher Emmanuel. And for Demember, this was the breaking point. He responded by ordering to have this couple and their child murdered. And to be clear, this is a big jump. Okay, this cult, they've kind of just been dancing around light criminality for a long time, but they'd never murdered anyone. But now, with his cancer diagnosis and with Jourette's public fall from grace, the 2 men felt like they had nothing to lose. It's pretty hard to know whose idea it was to end the cult with a series of murders and suicides. But in later inquests, the Quebec police insisted that there'd actually been some rumblings of mass suicide as early as 1983. And in fact, really, it was only Jourette's arrest warrant that prevented an earlier tragedy that would have otherwise claimed more lives because at that point they had more members. In a tape, likely dating to early 1994, Jourette and Demember discussed the Waco siege, saying that the Branch Davidians had beaten us to the punch. Demember also told Jourette that what we'll do will be even more spectacular. And then, in another tape from early 1994, Demember apparently said this: "We are rejected by the whole world. First, by the people. The people can no longer withstand us. And our Earth, fortunately, she rejects us. How would we leave otherwise? We also reject this planet. We wait for the day we can leave. Life, for me, is intolerable. Intolerable. I can't go on. So think about the dynamic that will get us to go elsewhere." Again, this seems to be a step that shows up in the timeline for every doomsday cult. First, they lose face via some negative press attention, and then the leadership starts telling everyone how government persecution renders their lives impossible. And I'd just like to point out that this is exactly what happened at Jonestown. Here's a quote from Jim Jones that he delivered to his followers right before they were forced to drink cyanide. Jim Jones said, "I have loved you. How very much I have tried my best to give you the good life. In spite of all that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our lives impossible." Do you see what I mean? Jim Jones said that in 1978 to his congregation in the jungle in Guyana. But it's basically the same thing that Dimambro was saying privately in 1984. It's this doctrine of absolute victimhood. And because they're victims, because they see themselves as the biggest victims in the whole world, they feel like they've got the right to do something terrible. And for Dimambro and Girette, the terrible thing that they felt like they had to do was to have Tony and Nikki murdered, along with their baby son, and then terminate the order of the Solar Temple with a series of ritualistic suicides that would set them on a homeward journey across the universe to Sirius, where they'd all live in perpetual bliss. Or at least that was the idea. Okay, heads up. This story is about to get really dark. And the murder of a baby, it might be hard to listen to. So just a little warning. Here's how it went down. Dimambro selected a fanatical 34-year-old member named Joel Egger to be the executioner. Joel was a formerly aspiring rock musician, and he'd had a prior drug addiction before joining the temple. But Dimambro told Joel that, actually, here's what you really are. You're the reincarnation of the soldier who poked Jesus Christ with his lance. So in order to make amends for this terrible crime like 2,000 years ago, you must destroy the Antichrist, which was this 3-year-old baby Christopher Emmanuel. Now, God knows why you'd believe this, but apparently Joel did. So on the 30th of September, 1994, Joel got on a plane with Dimambro's mistress, a woman named Dominique Bellaton, who was this blonde French lady who was also the mother of Dimambro's cosmic daughter, Emanuela. And the two of them arrived in Montreal in the late afternoon. Now, meanwhile, another 2 Swiss members over in Montreal, actually the suburb's called Morin Heights, it's a little ski town outside of Montreal, they'd invited Nikki and Tony over for dinner. This couple, they were longtime members of the cult, and their names were Colette Genaud, who was 49, and her husband, who was 39. So Tony and Nikki, they're at the Genaud's house, enjoying drinks, and they're ogling over the baby. And downstairs, a car crunches up the driveway, but the doorbell doesn't ring. And the Genauds were like, hey, Tony, was that a car? Did you just hear a car downstairs? Do you want to just, I've got my hands full. Do you want to just go down the stairs and see who it is? And he's like, yeah, sure, not a problem. So he goes downstairs, and then as soon as he steps out, Joel Egger beats him over the head, so he's unconscious. And then Joel stabs him 50 times, feverishly with a knife. And then the next thing that happens is that Joel thumps up the stairs with Dominique in tow, and he stabs Nikki 14 times as the Genauds just kind of look on. Later, prosecutors are going to highlight how he finished by stabbing her once in each breast because she had nursed the Antichrist. And then finally, and this is really horrific, Joel used an actual wooden cross, like a wooden cross with a sharpened point, to stab the baby right through the heart. And later, this same wooden cross was found with baby Christopher Emmanuel's body. Prosecutors would also later point out that both Tony and baby Christopher had been bled white. Joel and Dominique then said their goodbyes to the Genauds. And I can only imagine that at that point, all 4 of them must have been really shaken up. Joel seems like a pretty rough guy, but he wasn't that rough. He'd never killed anyone before. And presumably none of them had ever seen a dead body. There would have also been a lot of blood all over the house and all over Joel. And then there's the fact that all of them were planning to be dead within a week. So who knows how they were feeling? I can only imagine them hugging, or I don't know, maybe it was kind of quick and awkward. But they all said goodbye, and Joel and Dominique, they went back down the stairs, and then they actually got into Tony and Nikki's car, which, you can kind of imagine it would have still had the baby carrier in the back seat. And they drove back to Montreal Airport, and then they got on a plane back to Switzerland. We now know that Colette and Jerry Janaud, they spent the next 4 days carefully cleaning up the evidence. They got all the bodies and bundled them into a storage cupboard. Who knows how they felt or what they talked about, like, did they listen to music while they were cleaning? Did they compare notes on what they were going to do in the afterlife? I don't know. What do you do in a situation like that? What do you talk about? In my mind, it just seems like it would have been a horribly anxious couple of days. Then on October 4, the Janauds prepared themselves for departure. Jerry filled several plastic garbage bags with petrol, and he set them over detonators with a timer, and he laid them throughout the house. And then they laid themselves down on their beds. They put on all of their robes and all of their finery and their medals, and they each swallowed a handful of sleeping pills. And we think that by the time these incendiary devices went off, both of them were unconscious. But actually there's some autopsy evidence that I found that suggests that Jerry may have been awake. But by this point, the house was fully ablaze and they were both killed in the fire. Now, Morin Heights, it's a pretty wealthy area with a pretty attentive fire department. So the fire brigade, they showed up and they put out the fire. But to them, this whole murder scene, it looked like a pretty innocent house fire. Sure, they'd found this couple in the rubble, but there were no signs of violence. At that point, there was nothing untoward. Later, of course, when the cult's mass suicides in Switzerland became global news, the Canadian investigators went back. They were like, oh, shit, we should check out that house. They went back and they figured out what really happened. But we're actually going to pause here and we're going to pick up the rest of the story in part 2. Today's ep was a lot of backstory. It was really just to set up how a group of people can end their lives for a piece of fiction. And in part 2, we're going to unpack exactly how these mass suicides played out. I think it's going to be equal parts grueling, but hopefully fascinating. So I hope you'll join me. And I just want to say a big thanks to everyone who wrote one of the numerous articles, books, and reports from which I've gathered today's story. We're going to leave a reading list in the show notes just in case you want to go deep. And last thing, if any of you happen to have been in the Solar Temple, or if you know someone who was in the Solar Temple, please send me a DM on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. That's Julian Morgans, all one word, Julian Morgans. There's an S on the end of Morgans. Hit me up. And one last thing, please subscribe to the show. If you're enjoying this and you want to support us, we'd love it if you did. The single best thing that you can do is subscribe. And thank you, always, thank you for listening. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. Darcy Humphreys, Daniela Cantu, and Chloe Stelling are our interns. Our cover art is by Naomi Lee Beveridge, and this whole thing has been a Super Real production.
So good, so good, so good. Perfect gifts? We've got them at Nordstrom Rack stores now. UGG, Nike, Barefoot Dreams, Kate Spade New York, and more. Find everything on their wish list all in one place.
Steve Madden? Yes, please.
It's perfect.
Did we just score?
The greatest gifts of all time? Yeah.
Head to your Nordstrom Rack store to score. Great brands, great prices, the greatest gifts of all time.
This is a PSA, or public sock announcement. Experts have declared Bombas socks as the best way to warm up chilly feet. These pairs are super cushy, soft, and designed for maximum coziness. Plus, for every pair purchased, another pair will be donated, so someone in need of essential clothing can stay warm this winter. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/ACAST and use code ACAST at checkout.